Summer of 2022. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across my grandparents' farm. I had always loved this place as a kid, but something about it seemed different now. Maybe it was the absence of my grandparents, who had gone to visit my aunt in another state, leaving me to watch over the farm for a couple of nights. They promised to pay me for my trouble, and I agreed, thinking it would be an easy way to make some extra cash. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent most of the day lounging on the porch, sipping iced tea and reading a novel. As dusk fell, I made my rounds, ensuring that the barn was locked and the animals were secured. The cows were grazing peacefully in the field, the chickens were roosting, and the old farmhouse creaked in the gentle breeze. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I prepared for bed. But that calm was shattered on the second night. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a strange noise coming from the cornfield. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the stalks, but then I realized it was something more sinister. It was a low, rhythmic chanting, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. I got out of bed and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the farm, and I could just make out the shapes of the cows in the field. They were all standing still, their heads turned toward the cornfield, mooing in unison. Something was definitely wrong. I grabbed the shotgun my grandfather kept by the door and stepped outside. The chanting grew louder as I approached the cornfield, and I could hear voices mingled with the eerie sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved closer, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it. A cow was missing from the herd, and I could hear the muffled sounds of movement deeper within the cornfield. My instincts told me to turn back, but I pressed on, determined to find out what was happening. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Who's out there?" The chanting stopped abruptly, and there was a moment of eerie silence before the voices resumed, this time more frantic and agitated. I fired 2 rounds into the air, hoping to scare off whoever was lurking in the cornfield. But instead of fleeing, the voices grew louder, more insistent. I stepped into the cornfield, my flashlight flickering as I pushed through the tall stalks. The air was thick with the scent of earth and corn, and the ground was uneven beneath my feet. I could hear the voices clearly now, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Then I saw them, a group of figures standing in a clearing, illuminated by the flickering light of candles. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by creepy masks. One figure stood out, a tall person wearing a mask that seemed to be grinning grotesquely in the moonlight. "Get out of here!" I shouted, raising the shotgun. "This is private property." The figures didn't move. They continued their chanting, their voices rising and falling in a haunting cadence. I fired another round into the air, but they stood their ground, unmoved by the warning shots. Fear turned to panic as I realized these people had no intention of leaving. I turned to run, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, dropping the flashlight. It rolled away, casting a brief beam of light on the ground. That's when I saw it, a cow's head, severed and placed in the center of a circle of candles. Blood pooled around it, and the sight was enough to make my stomach churn. I scrambled to my feet and fired 6 rounds in the direction of the figures, hoping to scare them off. The chanting stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, one by one, the figures began to laugh. It was a low, mocking sound that echoed through the cornfield. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the farmhouse. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I recounted what had happened to the dispatcher. They assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. The next few minutes felt like hours. I could hear the distant wail of sirens growing louder, and I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see the figures approaching the house. But the farm remained eerily quiet, the only sound the low mooing of the cows. When the police arrived, I ran out to meet them, my relief palpable. I led them to the cornfield, where the candles had burned out, leaving only the grisly sight of the cow's head in the circle. The officers looked grim as they surveyed the scene, and they called in a search team to comb the area. The search turned up nothing. No signs of the figures, no evidence of their presence beyond the cow's head and the remains of the candles. The police took my statement and assured me they would continue to investigate, but I could tell they were skeptical. I spent the rest of the night in a state of shock, unable to sleep. Every noise, every creak of the old farmhouse set my nerves on edge. By morning, I was exhausted, but the fear hadn't subsided. The police had left, but they promised to keep an eye on the farm. I tried to go about my day as usual, but the events of the previous night weighed heavily on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those figures in the cornfield were still out there, lurking in the shadows. That evening, as the sun began to set, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I hesitated before opening it. To my relief, it was one of the officers who had been at the farm the night before. "We've been patrolling the area," he said, his expression serious. "We haven't found anything yet, but we're not taking any chances. We've increased our presence in the area and will be conducting regular patrols." I thanked him and closed the door, feeling a small measure of relief, but the fear still lingered, a constant presence at the back of my mind. I decided to call my grandparents and tell them what had happened. They were shocked and insisted on cutting their trip short to return to the farm. The next few nights passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every time I walked past the cornfield, I remembered the chanting, the figures in the masks, and the cow's head in the circle of candles. It was a sight that would haunt me for a long time. When my grandparents returned, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. They were horrified by what had happened and promised to take every precaution to ensure it wouldn't happen again. They installed better locks on the doors and windows, set up security cameras around the property, and even got a guard dog to help protect the farm. But despite these measures, I couldn't bring myself to feel completely safe. The memory of that night lingered, a dark shadow over my mind. I couldn't help but wonder who those people were, why they had chosen our farm, and what their true intentions were. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The farm continued to thrive, and I gradually pushed the events of that night to the back of my mind. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of the cornfield out of the corner of my eye, and the fear would return, a cold knot in my stomach. One night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of chanting carried on the wind. My heart raced as I grabbed the shotgun and headed to the window. Peering out into the darkness, I saw nothing, but the chanting continued, growing louder and more insistent. I called the police, my voice trembling as I told them what was happening. They assured me they were on their way and told me to stay inside. I locked the doors and windows, my heart pounding in my chest. The chanting grew louder, closer, and I could hear footsteps outside. I backed away from the window, my mind racing with fear. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as the front door burst open, and I heard footsteps inside the house. I fired the shotgun, the sound deafening in the small room. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, I heard a low, mocking laugh, the same laugh I had heard in the cornfield. I fired again, blindly, hoping to hit whoever was in the house. The laughter continued, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, the shotgun raised, but there was no one there. Panic set in as I realized I was out of ammunition. I dropped the shotgun and ran, my only thought to get away from whatever was in the house. I burst through the back door and ran into the cornfield, the chanting following me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the field, my lungs burning and my legs trembling. I looked back, expecting to see the figures behind me, but there was nothing. The chanting had stopped, and the night was silent. The police arrived a few minutes later, their lights cutting through the darkness. I ran to them, my relief overwhelming. Living on my family's farm had always been a mixed bag. On one hand, there was a sense of peace and connection to nature that was hard to find anywhere else. On the other hand, the isolation could be unsettling, especially at night. But never had it been as terrifying as the night that forever changed my life. It was late summer in 2018, and the air was thick with humidity. The farm, located miles away from the nearest town, was a haven for my sisters and me. Our parents had gone to a neighboring state for a weekend getaway, leaving me, Howard, a 25-year-old, tasked with watching over the place and protecting my younger sisters, Emily and Sarah. The day had been uneventful. We spent it working on chores, tending to the animals, and relaxing in the late afternoon sun. As night fell, we settled into our routine. The dogs, Rex and Luna, were outside in the backyard, their presence a reassuring deterrent against any potential intruders. I was just about to head to bed when I heard the dogs barking furiously. Their usual calm demeanor had given way to frantic barking and growling. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside to see what had set them off. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I heard it, a soft, eerie whistling coming from the cornfield. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the darkness, but the dense rows of corn obscured everything beyond the first few feet. I went back inside to grab my shotgun, an old family heirloom that had seen better days but was still functional. My sisters were in the living room, watching a movie. "What's going on, Howard?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with concern. "There's someone out in the cornfield," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to check it out." "Are you crazy?" Sarah exclaimed. "You can't go out there in the dark." "Don't worry, I'll be fine," I assured them, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "Just stay inside and lock the doors." I stepped back outside, the shotgun in hand, and fired a shot into the air. The dogs went wild again, barking and growling at the unseen intruder. Suddenly, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the cornfield. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised the gun. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted. The figure turned and ran into the cornfield, disappearing from view. I fired another shot into the air, hoping to scare them off. I called the dogs inside and bolted the door behind me. I dialed my dad's number, my hands trembling. He answered on the second ring. "Dad, there's someone out in the cornfield," I said, my voice shaking. I fired a couple of shots, but they ran off. "Howard, you need to be the man of the house," my dad replied, his tone serious. "Protect your sisters and stay inside. Call the police if you need to." I hung up, trying to steady my nerves. The whistling started again, closer this time. I looked out the window and saw a man slowly walking on the grass, his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. He stopped and turned to look directly at me, still whistling that eerie tune. I grabbed the shotgun from the bed and aimed it out the window. I fired a shot into the grass a few feet away from him. He turned and ran, disappearing from view. I quickly closed and locked the window. "What's happening?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "There's a man outside," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "But don't worry, he won't be coming back." The hours that followed were some of the longest of my life. Every noise, every creak of the old farmhouse set my nerves on edge. I stayed up all night, the shotgun by my side, keeping watch over my sisters. The dogs had calmed down, but they stayed close, sensing my unease. The next day, I called the local sheriff and reported the incident. He promised to send a deputy to patrol the area and keep an eye on things. My parents cut their trip short and returned home, concerned for our safety. For weeks, the memory of that night haunted me. The whistling, the shadowy figure, the feeling of being watched. It all played over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the fear that he would come back. Months passed, and life on the farm slowly returned to normal. But the sense of security I once felt was gone, replaced by a constant vigilance. Every night, I made sure the doors and windows were locked, and I kept the shotgun within reach. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard the dogs barking again. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The whistling started, faint at first, but growing louder. I shone the flashlight toward the cornfield and saw the man standing there, his face obscured by a hood. He was whistling that same eerie tune. My hands trembled as I raised the shotgun. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The man didn't move. He just stood there whistling, as if taunting me. I fired a shot into the air, but he didn't flinch. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the dogs inside and locked the door, my mind racing. I called the sheriff again, my voice shaking as I told him what was happening. "We'll send someone over right away," he assured me. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the deputies to arrive. The whistling continued, growing louder and more insistent. I kept my eyes on the windows, expecting to see the man at any moment. Finally, the sound of sirens broke through the night. The deputies arrived, their lights flashing as they pulled up to the house. I ran out to meet them, my relief palpable. They searched the area, but the man was gone. There were no signs of him, no tracks, no evidence that he had been there. The deputies assured me they would keep a close watch on the farm, but I could tell they were skeptical. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak set my nerves on edge. I kept the shotgun by my side, my finger on the trigger. The fear that he would come back was overwhelming. The next morning, I decided to install security cameras around the property. I set them up at strategic points, covering the house, the barn, and the cornfield. I hoped that the cameras would provide some sense of security, but the fear lingered. Days turned into weeks, and there were no more incidents. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, and the deputies' patrols turned up nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. One night, as I was reviewing the footage from the security cameras, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the screen, was the man. He was standing at the edge of the cornfield, watching the house. He stood there for hours, unmoving, before disappearing into the night. I called the sheriff again, my voice trembling as I told him what I had seen. He promised to send a deputy over to review the footage and keep an eye on the farm. The fear that had been slowly subsiding came rushing back, overwhelming me. The next day, the deputy arrived and reviewed the footage. He agreed that it was disturbing and promised to increase patrols in the area, but there was little they could do without more information. That night, I stayed up, watching the monitors, the shotgun by my side. I felt a sense of dread, knowing that he could come back at any moment. The hours passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard the whistling again. It was faint, but unmistakable. I looked at the monitors and saw the man standing at the edge of the cornfield watching the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the shotgun and headed outside. I fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't move. He just stood there, whistling as if mocking me. I fired another shot, aiming at the ground a few feet away from him. He turned and ran into the cornfield, disappearing from view. I called the sheriff again, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. He promised to send a deputy over right away. I locked the doors and windows, my heart racing, and waited for the deputies to arrive. The minutes felt like hours as I watched the monitors, expecting to see the man at any moment. Finally, the deputies arrived, their lights flashing as they pulled up to the house. I ran out to meet them, my relief palpable. They searched the area, but the man was gone. There were no signs of him, no tracks, no evidence that he had been there. The deputies assured me they would keep a close watch on the farm, but I could tell they were skeptical. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak set my nerves on edge. I kept the shotgun by my side, my finger on the trigger. The fear that he would come back was overwhelming. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up additional security cameras and motion sensors around the property. I even installed floodlights to illuminate the area around the house. I hoped that these measures would provide some sense of security, but the fear lingered. Life on a farm has always had its own rhythm, a mix of hard work and the serenity of the countryside. My husband Tom and I owned a farm in Buckingham, Iowa. The days were long, but we cherished the life we had built together. On weekends, we often had friends over, enjoying the simple pleasures of good company and a few drinks. But one weekend night in particular would forever change our perception of safety and peace in our own home. It was a Saturday evening in late summer. The air was cool and the sky was clear, filled with stars. We had invited a few friends over for drinks and laughs, and by 11 p.m., everyone was pretty drunk. The laughter and chatter that had filled the house slowly dwindled as our friends bid us goodnight and drove off into the night. Tom and I were cleaning up the mess left behind, still chuckling over the night's antics, when a sudden knock at the door shattered the quiet. I glanced at Tom, my heart skipping a beat. It was well past the hour for unexpected visitors. "Who could that be?" I asked, my voice tinged with unease. Tom shrugged, looking equally puzzled. He walked over to the door, but before he could open it, a voice called out from the other side, "Can I use your phone? My car broke down." The voice was strange, almost as if the person was trying to make it sound higher than normal. It didn't sound like anyone we knew. Tom hesitated, then turned back to me. "Do you think it could be George? Maybe he had car trouble on his way home." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at me. George was one of our closest friends and had been at the gathering earlier. Tom picked up his phone and called George to confirm. "George, is that you outside? Someone's asking to use the phone," Tom said, his voice steady but wary. George sounded confused. "No, I'm already home. I left about half an hour ago. Do you need me to come back?" Tom's face paled. "Yes, please, hurry." He hung up and turned to me, his eyes wide with concern. "It's not George." My heart raced as we heard another knock at the door, followed by the sound of footsteps walking around the house. We exchanged worried glances, the situation growing more unsettling by the second. Tom grabbed his shotgun from the closet, his expression grim. "Cheryl, call 911. I nodded, my hands trembling as I dialed the number. The operator's calm voice did little to ease my panic as I explained the situation. She assured me that officers were on their way. Meanwhile, the footsteps continued, now accompanied by the sound of someone trying to lift one of the windows. The adrenaline surged through me as I realized the intruder was trying to break into our home. Tom positioned himself near the front door, shotgun at the ready. The moments stretched into what felt like an eternity as we waited for George and the police to arrive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sent chills down my spine. Finally, George's truck pulled up to the house, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He stepped out, looking around cautiously. "I didn't see anyone on my way here," he called out, his voice low. Tom unlocked the door and let him in, relief evident on his face. "Thanks for coming, George." George nodded, his expression serious. "Did you see who it was?" Tom shook his head. "No, just heard the voice and the footsteps. They were trying to get in through the windows." A few minutes later, the police arrived, their lights flashing in the night. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the property with their flashlights. They approached the house, their expressions professional and focused. "Evening," one of the officers said. "We're here to check out the disturbance." Tom explained what had happened, detailing the strange voice and the attempted break-in. The officers conducted a thorough search of the property, but found no sign of the intruder. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. "We'll keep an eye on the area tonight," the lead officer assured us. "If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call." We thanked them and watched as they drove away, their presence a small comfort in the unsettling quiet. George stayed with us for a while longer, helping to calm our nerves before heading home. That night, sleep was elusive. Every sound, every shadow seemed magnified in the darkness. Tom and I lay in bed, holding each other tightly, the fear of the unknown weighing heavily on our minds. The next morning, we decided to take additional precautions. We installed security cameras on the front and back of the house, hoping that the extra layer of protection would provide some peace of mind. But the fear lingered, a constant reminder of the night's events. Days turned into weeks, and life on the farm slowly returned to normal. The cameras captured nothing unusual, and the police patrols in the area seemed to deter any further incidents. But the memory of that night remained, a dark cloud over our once peaceful home. One evening, as the sun was setting, I was reviewing the footage from the security cameras when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the shadows at the edge of the property, was a figure. They were standing still, watching the house. I called Tom over, my voice shaking. "Tom, look at this." He stared at the screen, his expression turning from curiosity to concern. "We need to call the police." The officers arrived quickly, reviewing the footage and conducting another search of the property. But once again, the intruder had vanished without a trace. "We'll increase patrols in the area," the lead officer said. "But without more information, there's not much else we can do." The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. We had taken every precaution, but it seemed like nothing could keep the fear at bay. The figure in the shadows was a constant reminder that we were being watched, that our home was no longer the safe haven it once was. Weeks passed, and the figure appeared sporadically on the footage, always at night, always watching. We never saw them during the day, and the police could never catch them. The stress was taking its toll on both Tom and me, and our once happy home was now filled with tension and fear.